pleasure to say a few words about our next keynote speaker, Stewart. Bruce taught English and Anglo-Irish literature at the University of Ulster for 25 years before joining the Federal University of Cambridge Technology in Brazil. Retired, right? He was secretary of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures and assistant edited the Oxford Companion to Irish Literature. In 2004, he published a book of James Joyce with Oxford University in the series Very Interesting People. He created the Corso, which is a widely used online resource on Irish writers. Very useful indeed. Bruce holds a degree in English literature from Trinity College, Dublin, a master's degree in modern English from the University of California, and a PhD on James Joyce from Trinity College. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Staying here this morning perhaps is more appropriate. I asked our friend to put up on the screen the front page report, so just in case anyone doesn't know it, which is unlikely in fact, but anyway, the thing is, Google likes it and it comes up quite often when you search for stuff, and it's a compilation, it's a pure compilation. I suspect it's deeply illegal insofar as the copyright issues are murky. I've never tried to make a penny out of it, and never shall. But I have a very loyal son promises that when I give up my mortal coil, he will continue it for a reasonable period of time. Not to say continue to chock it full of your writing, but to make it available. So there we are. Now, I moved my subject, and I'm going to do the old-fashioned thing and simply read, although I have a copy of the PowerPoint. It looks like an awful lot of chapters, but these are rather short sections. If you don't mind, I'll start here with an introduction. My topic today is James Joyce's reaction to Yeats's vision in Finnegan's Wake. And with it, Yeats's reaction to Joyce's great novel Ulysses, which he cites in the former, and to illustrate the unhappy stage in his lunar cycles before the Corso or return, when the historical mystical phases of history begin again. A dubious favour which Joyce returned by incorporating phrases from a vision in his own somewhat visionary chapter called Night Lessons in Book 2 of Finnegan's Wake. The question promptly arises whether Joyce's similar resort to diagrams, along with his clever pastiche of Yeats's actual words, amounts to concerted parody, or is it really evidence of a parallel project in cosmography at the end of their very different imaginative careers? Although the chronology of the Wake manuscript shows Joyce through his scatological map of the womb of your eternal geomater in pseudo-Euclidean terms, visible on page 293 of that work, and I simply refer to pages, unlike Joyce scholars on not lines. In the summer of 1926, and therefore months after the publication of a vision in January 26, contrary to the title page, it has been genetically proven that he added his Yeatsian borrowings during a later revision only. To that extent, the diagram at least cannot be conceived of as pure parody of anything in its pages, although it may well reflect the sort of thinking Joyce imagined Yeats was involved in at that time. Bernard Benstock made the observation many years ago that although Joyce may have enjoyed mocking the homegrown theosophists of his native Dublin, he nonetheless carefully looked over their shoulders and rarely missed any of their tricks. In truth, in the intersecting triangles in the emerald tablets, Trismegistus, meaning, of course, that which is above is that which is below, form just such an image as he might avail himself of in mopping up theologies of cults in Vinegar's Wake. In fact, he had a much more proximate source in a well-known schoolboy geometry textbook known as Tot Hunter, and a less proximate one in its own heretical attempt to locate the logos of the womb of every woman inside instead of its usual lying place in Christian theology, Mariology, or even its Yeatsian location in the Anima Mundi, and its vernacular counterpart, the great memory, which is a phrase Joyce did not blush to use early on in his career, speaking of a great memory that is greater than our memory, in which he expected to find the affirmation of the spirit in his Mangan lecture. And it's a matter of some critical importance that Leopold Bloom tacitly dissents from this idea when Stephen drunkenly reproduces the verbatim on the morning of June the 17th, 1904. Yet Finnegan's Wake is a different book, and the totalizing mythology it embodies calls for a different treatment of the Logos, and one which merits being called visionary for all its secular and humoristic features. I'm just putting 2 pages of quotations to distract you while I complete the introduction. One being a set of books you easily recognize from Yeats, and the other a set from Joyce. I should say, by the way, that Yeats's title appears in these. I'm sorry, I'm a bit out of line. It will follow in a moment. If we can go to the next screen, please. There we are, Yeats. And the one after is Joyce. I leave it to you to move it on in a few minutes when you see fit. It's suggested that the works of W. Yeats and James Joyce can equally be approached as visionary. The first objection to be met with is that while W. Yeats characteristically employed the rhetoric and method of a visionary poet, James Joyce neither invoked or used any such procedure in practice or in theory. Indeed, he professed himself content to go down in literary history as a scissors and paste man. From the outset, he made it his business to capture the reality of experience in prose and drama on the premise that we must accept life as we see it before our eyes, men and women as we meet them in the real world, not as we apprehend them in the world of fairy. Clearly, contra Yeats, although he's not mentioned by name. At the earliest stage of his career in notebooks, books, and lectures, unlike Yeats, he was not an essayist as in later life. In fact, he called himself a man of letters on his passport, a point that I raised with Victor, who's done me a great service by giving an excellent lecture on Joyce meets Yeats, which obviates me from covering a rather mechanical passage in my thesis. Indeed, he professed himself to go down, ever so sorry, at the early stage of his career. Unlike Yeats, he was not an essayist. Joyce stated the difference he felt to exist between them and the Irish revival, most pointedly in a paper on James Tarrant's Mangan as a student at University College Dublin, Royal University, in his 19th year. For Yeats, Mangan had been that strange visionary ruined by drink and narcotics who wrote some half a dozen lyrics of indescribable beauty. For Joyce, he was the most significant poet of the modern Celtic world, but also, less happily, one who receives the last and worst of a tradition which Joyce identifies as hysterical nationalism. The history of his country closed him so straitly that even in his hours of extreme individual passion, he could barely reduce its walls to ruins. The implacable tenor of Joyce's anti-patriotic nego is something which student contemporaries well remember, though Irish and other critics have recently argued that his trademark literary experimentalism is inherently anti-hegemonic and therefore party to the core of the impulse for Irish freedom. I have in mind there particularly Emer Nolan and I suppose James Heaney. James, that's his name. and Luke Gibbons in his James Joyce and Irish Nationalism in 224, still going strong. The world that defines Joyce and that which includes a vice-regal cavalcade, admittedly not vision, and a Union Jack behind the door of Liverpool's living room, noted but not remarked on. The term, or the disparaging term, Castle Catholic, should be wide enough to include Joyce thieves in there. The distinction that Joyce drew between the revivalist himself in 1901 coincide with the difference between classical and romantic tempers. Most people are familiar with this, so I'm not going to particularly stress what follows, but in fact his idea was that, first of all, the classic temper is not simply the romantic temper grown over. Secondly, that the romantic temper is unsatisfied and impatient, sees no fit abode for its ideals, and chooses to behold them under insensible figures. Contrarily, the classic temper chooses to bend rather on present things and so work upon them with the quick intelligence can grasp the unuttered, etc. In this method, he concluded, the sane and joyful spirit itself issues forth and achieves an imperishable perfection. You hear more of that word imperishable because it's not a Joycean word at all. Yeatsians will recognize its context immediately. At the same time, he espoused a slow, elaborate art of patience, which he distinguished radically from the heroic and fabulous. And in all this, of course, he differs from Yeats, who latterly called himself romantics, along with Lady Gregory and John Millington Synge, although I'm not entirely sure how John Millington Synge passes for romantic. In spite of this profession, Yeats was very much a modern poet in his later work, and no longer the lone swan drifting on the darkening flood. In fact, by the time of writing that poem, he had already published a vision, work that epitomizes the sense of civilization under pressure, which he shared with T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. What promised to emerge in history's next cycle was some rough beast slouching to Bethlehem to be born, an image which he explicitly identified with the stream of irrational force, bringing new races seeking to dominate, although he doesn't say whom. Listening me? In autobiographies, he claimed to have foreseen the growing murderousness of the world, while the preface of Resurrection foretells a new social order, deliberate, systematized, external, self-conscious, and in its way, of closing the Christian era of, I presume, individual conscience, but I'm not entirely sure how to read that. In short, a second coming of fascistic proportions. Whatever about its claim to prescience, the second coming formally invokes the idea of visionary experience. Hardly are those words out, then an image comes out of the spiritus mundi to trouble my sight, and then just as abruptly, the darkness drops again upon the poet's eyes. We are not to suppose that the poet, working in his lonely tower, suddenly ran out of lamp oil. Turning to a vision for illumination, vision A specifically, we find that the great year reaches its intellectual climax in the phase of the moon immediately after that in which James Joyce holds his place, according to Yeats's computations, or more precisely, if less credibly, those of his spiritual communicators. I've rather lost touch with it, so you could flash this forward a bit. There's James Joyce, that's his stuff on below. That's what I should have shown you in the first place, to show the semi-basic contrast. I probably mislabeled the one there, I think it's from TRN. I'm suggesting it's from the next week, if you please, is an indication of the source of Joyce's own diagram, which is Todd Hunter, or more precisely, Casey's edition of Todd Hunter in '85, which was used as a school book, I assume in Longow's Wood, being published in 1885, but still conventionally referred to as Todd Hunter. a timetable which makes it relatively clear that Joyce began his work on the night essence sector before he had ever seen a vision. The book simply hadn't arrived yet. And we know, in fact, from his library holdings that it was the B vision which he held, in which he receives no mention. So he may well have been quite unaware. Or he may have had by hearsay, one doesn't know. I don't think it feels like that. And if you go on, I might have some before Jermaine, but I'll work towards that as soon as I can. In the vision, then, he says, in the 23rd phase, it is said that this 21st stage is phase, forgive me, is the first where there is hatred of the abstract, where the intellect turns upon itself. Mr. Ezra Pound, Mr. Eliot, Mr. Joyce, Signor Pirandello, who break the logical process of thought by flooding it with associated ideas that seem to drift out of the mind by chance. 3 examples follow. Henry IV, the wasteland Ulysses, respectively described as a lunatic among his keepers. I think that's Henry IV. Sure, I get it. A man fishing behind the gasworks. That's Eliot. And the vulgarity of a single day in Dublin extended over 700 pages, he writes. The passage goes on, it is as though myth and fact, united under the exhaustion of the Renaissance, have now fallen so far apart that man understands for the first time the rigidity of fact and pulls up by that very recognition myth, the mask, which now but gropes its way out of the mind's dark, but shall soon pursue and terrify, in which he simply flows over into his own apocalyptic vision. If this is intended as a critique of Ulysses, it can only mean that Joyce, at first, gives in to the sheer contingency of the modern world, criticism leveled against him by Wyndham Lewis in Time and Western Man, and Joyce called Wyndham Lewis for that, big time. And he then mobilizes, in reaction to what T.S. Eliot calls, in 1923, a continuous parallel between contemporary and antiquity by means of a mythic parallel and especially a Homeric framework. The parallel between Yeats' reading and Eliot's here is particularly interesting, raising as it does the question of influence of personal exchanges, a reference to the flight of the birds, for example, in Eliot's notes towards the definition of culture. Always seemed to me was tantalizing instance of conversational accord. But I say I'll leave that for another occasion, but let me just briefly mention that Eliot says that once you decapitate a society by removing its aristocracy, its elite, its best, goes adrift, loses its culture, it requires them to sustain it. I don't think this critique of Irish cultural history is quite on the ball. It's fairly to be expected that since Joyce had something to say about Yeats, Joyce might have something to say about a vision. The key here is the 9th lesson of this episode, we'll say there, in the second book of the Wake, which incorporates the diagram you've seen on 293, but broadly resembles Joyce's vision. Broadly, very broadly. Especially to cones and jars, which offer a kinetic view of historical time. The point being, historical time is mapped in them. In addition, the episode is studded with snippets from Joyce's book. At one point, from Yeats' book, and at one point, Joyce unmistakably parodies an entire sentence from it. However, rather than treating it as a case of literary badinage, I would suggest that Joyce's last work is fundamentally akin in aim and method to a vision, with the difference, as Joyce would see it, that he put it in an artistic work and not in a discursive byblow, criticism which he verbally made of Yeats. This is especially true as regards the cosmographic impulse displayed in each, considered as an attempt to totalize an increasingly complex world, which Joyce ingeniously calls the chaos of all. Excuse me, you know the phrase, the chaosmos of all. Though whether he was nearly as alarmed by democracy or general relativity as his Anglo-American fellow modernists is another question. Found one. For many reasons, reasons, Yeats and Joyce frame their ideas in terms as different as possible from each other, as different, to be exact, as Plato and Aristotle. Yet even here, despite even taking up formally opposite positions in an ancient quarrel, there is evidence of a later convergence with shiftings on both sides and a keen and mutual awareness of each other's respective positions. Some consideration of the chronology of night lessons should enter here. We can go back to the chronology. That does the job quite satisfactorily for me. In fact, Joyce produced the first version in the summer of 1926, including the triangle. He then expanded it into a piece called The Thickest Mud That Was Ever Heard Jump. Sounds rather low. For publication in transition in February 28. It subsequently appeared in Tales Told of Shem and Sean, published by the Black Sun Press in 29, with a cover quote by Frank Kruse, who led his father to say, "The boy seems to have changed a good deal," but we think that's apocryphal. It's an interesting thing that Lamb O'Brien slipped into the 1949 Joyce Memorial Edition. However, he had not done with night lessons and continued to add to the manuscript from 1933 to 1937 in his way before submitting it to favor for publications, and even then there were some last moment adjustments in the galley. It seems to us in the final revisions, and already substantially complete, he received a copy of the vision in the 1937 edition, in which the allusion to himself was omitted, and he chose to incorporate that material. What did Joyce make of Yeats' vision? Eugene Jolas told Ellman that Joyce expressed great admiration for its colossal conception, regretting only that Yeats had not put it in a greater work. What did Yeats make of Joyce's parody of the occult holograph? There is no evidence that he knew any of the versions of Night Lessons that appeared in transitions, while death prevented him from viewing the final published work in his lifetime, the first printed copy having reached Joyce on his 57th birthday, 2 days after Yeats, Matthew, passed away, in brackets, or passed on. As aside from that, so he might have seen it in his post-lifetime. Aside from that, the elements of the vision which are parodied are not those which relate to Joyce in person. The implications are rather odd, since he cannot have seen it in 1925, actually, in which Yeats made use of his name. In fact, there's a conclusion drawn by Ellman at a certain junction. In his first edition of the biography, he said, as John V. Keller points out, the diagram of Sean used in Finnegan's Wake is one of the many places where Joyce is parodying a vision. But in the 1984 edition, he revised that, no doubt under advisement, reading, to Joyce probably did not see another attack upon him, other than the Wyndham Lewis, by Yeats in the first limited edition of the vision at the beginning of 1926. It was omitted in the second edition of 37, which Joyce did see. That he did not see the passage in which his name is mentioned, and he did not hear of it. Moreover, the Night Lessons chapter cannot be regarded as a parody of Yeats' vision in any form, since the core of that chapter, first known as Triangle, was actually written in 1926. It does not, therefore, expressly share in Pound's dismissive comment, which he wrote in a letter to John Quinn when he said, very, very bughouse. More abusive remarks about the resort to lunar phases, nor even Alden's attribution of the character to the Southern Californian side of W.B.H. It may be concluded, therefore, that whatever the diagram in Finnegan's Wake means, its meaning is primarily, if not exclusively, Joycean rather than Yeatsian, which possibly suggests I shouldn't be here, but I hope to justify my presence a little bit longer. In fact, it's not impossibly difficult to find a meaning in Joyce's diagram. Can we move back, don't mind diagram itself. Right back to there it is on Eden's page. It does have another triangle underneath. The function of that triangle, of course, is, well, it's Pisca. Piscis, if you keep in mind, and it's vulva, if you haven't, which is actually specified in the text. We have this sort of thing. The diagram incorporates two intersecting circles standing for internecine relations between fratricidal and parricidal brothers who compete with their father for the affections of the female, who may be a mother, a daughter, or a sister. The case of Issy. These are metamorphic characters who appear in the wake as almost anyone you like. Cosmological, Wellington, Napoleon, O'Connell, Tester, his dueling partner, who enact the part of contraries upon which all progression depends, according to the Brunonian theory, which is adopting. It also represents the geography of Dublin, with the quote, like our twain bicircular roads, doubling bicirculars, mating approximately, mating note, their sweet boy and boy, done looping into each other. The footnote will tell you there were two tunnels. One was a Theosophist, the other was a Scot who had mentioned the magic wheel. But the diagram of Finneg's Wake is not about geometry or geography or gynecology or even theosophy per se. The clearest statement made about its meaning in the text, albeit expressed as a quasi-mathematical equation, refers to the word incarnate of the Johannine scripture, that's to say the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 1:1, delivered here with some nihilistic overtones. The logos of someone to that base anything, when most characteristically mantissa minus, mantissa has a mathematical meaning, comes to nullum in the end. It's a fairly negative proposition, a bit like Yeats's Destination of Reality, if you will, or any other touch of Buddhistic or non-Buddhistic innocence about Yeats. To this, the naughty schoolgirl Issy adds a footnote. She writes the footnotes. She says, neither a soul to be saved nor a body to be kicked. And this might lead one to the conclusion that the Creator did not believe in afterlives in any form, or relieved of all that. Thus, this uniquely Joycean combination of scholasticism and obstetrics, theology of the word, fused with the mechanics of reproduction in a manner which Lynch aptly dubs pornosophical philotheology, or metaphysics in Mecklenburg Street, Brothel Street in Dublin, in Ulysses, is indeed very much what we're looking at there. A good clue might be a sentence which he studiously copied from Aristotle's De Anima in his 1903 notebook. Interesting history about the notebooks. We thought they were two, but we now know there were one. They're in the possession of the National Library, and Fran O'Rourke is the person to go to find out all about that. Aristotle wrote, and Joyce translated from translation by Bartholomew, which Jacobert has unearthed in the Saint-Genevieve Library. He translated it into English. The most natural act for living beings which are complete is to produce other beings like themselves and therefore participate as far as they may in the eternal and the divine. So what's being continually reproduced is form, not the individual, but the form. And the form is typically in scholasticism the formable essence, and the formable essence is what Joyce is trying to capture in the Epiphany. So it all works all well, but on this occasion he's introducing perhaps you could call a scatological note. He wrote a review of John Bernard's book on Aristotle and education in 1902, in fact, previous year. He said, the modern notion of Aristotle as a biologist, a popular notion among the advocates of science, is probably less true than the ancient notion of him as a metaphysician, certainly in the higher applications of his severe method that he achieves himself. Now, I note finally that in Joyce this is hardly metaphysics. It is in fact what Walter Pater called, with serviceable reference to many modern writers, anti-metaphysical physics. Much of the form of metaphysics is persisting. I'm aware of issues of time. What do I have? Really long time? How long?
About 10.
10? Okay.
This is two more questions. We can do
All right, okay. There are two occasions when Joyce labeled the difference between his attitude and that of Yeats towards William Defoe. The first was an essay on precisely Defoe and William Blake, which he gave in Trieste University in March 1912. And he said, in English literature, Blake represents the most significant and truest form of idealism. He was not, however, Anglo-Saxon. Indeed, he possessed a quality contrary to this type, and you won't find it there. And most of all, his hatred of commerce. He was Irish and manifested in his art those characteristics most particular to the Irish, to his people. Now, he can only have got the idea that Blake was Irish, of course, from Yeats's preface to the Edmund Ellis Yeats edition, and possibly repeated in the preface to the poems. But it's generally understood that Joyce took his life of Blake from Ellis, not Joyce, because he spells Boucher, not Bouchier. In other words, he makes a mess of the name. His spelling never being terribly good. Of Robert Bruce's, Joyce says cleverly that it's a prototype of the British colonist, as Man Friday, trusty savage who arrives on an unlucky day, is a symbol of the subject races. But he's particularly interested in an encounter between Defoe and a certain Duncan Campbell, who had the art in the 18th century of knowing your name by looking at your face. And Defoe met him on occasion. He lived at the Strand in London, although Joyce has it that he lived in Scotland, clearly in this reading. Yeah, and it's described here in Eric Boulson's Cambridge Handbook as an encounter between the Celt and the Anglo-Saxon, borrowing Joyce's phrase. Boulson isn't at all sure what Joyce is getting at here, and he suggests maybe the realist Joyce seems to be suggesting that we are wondering how Defoe's description of the boy visionary necessarily translates into an encounter between the Anglo-Saxon and the Celt. In other words, Celtic, in other words, he just doesn't know what Joyce is getting at. But what Joyce is getting at was what Yeats is getting at. Joyce was miles away from Dublin, and it was highly convenient to pack Yeatsian racial philosophy into his lecture to a foreign audience, particularly an audience which comprised of an irredentist public who wanted to be Italian and was stuck in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, much as Yeats in his tour of America in 1904 was very happy to say outrageously Republican things about Robert Emmet and others, and indeed to publish famous remarks like there is no great literature without a great nationality, no great nationality without great literature, which sadly played into the hands of Arthur Griffith, who lambasted him for it when he produced the In the Shadow of the Men, which seems to be a pastiche of the story by Boccaccio with origins in Satyricon, which they knew very well, called The Widow of Ephesus, a tricky game, literary propaganda. I'm skipping rather now, and I'm simply trying to pick out my best points. I'm probably over length, but I want to touch on Job Learson's contribution to Joyce scholarship, which really is my terminus at Quailman this morning. Learson gives an extended account of the development of Anglo-Irish folklore history, fascinating book, romantic memory and imagination in different representation of Irish history. 19th century version is an earlier book on the previous centuries. And in the course of it, he harps upon Thomas Crawford Croker, whom he identifies correctly, I think, as Yeats's great predecessor in the collections of the day. And he picks out, in fact, a passage from the preface of Crofton's book, which indicates exactly the difference of angle. I do not intend to rehearse all those on paper here somewhere. Joyce's riposte to Matthew Arnold, in fact, some 50 years before, 1867, 1897 was that, and 40 years before, 30 years before, rather after the event, Eugene Burt's Matthew Arnold's conception of Ireland and turns it into a historic literature containing ancient wisdom preserved in the aspect of Irish rural poverty. The aspect is a phrase from John Eglinton. No, T.C. Thomas Crofton Kroger had this to say: "My aim," he said, "had been to bring to the twilight tales of the peasantry, before the view of the philosopher, as, if suffered to remain unnoticed, the latent belief in them might long have lingered amongst the inhabitants of the wild mountains and lonesome glens to retard progress of civilization." Most of us are aware that Yeats had some problem later on in the case of the Rancher Carey, Bridget, who was burnt alive in Tipperary in 1897 and caused Joyce some embarrassment because she was burnt, obviously, and she was believed to be a changeling, and he had just issued his mystical statement on Irish changelings, which seemed to encourage country murders. T. Kroger goes on to mention a specific case in which a mother drowns her boy because she thinks he's a changeling and receives instructions from the very Anglo-Irish GP to dismiss the case on the basis that the poor ignorant lady didn't know what she was doing. Indeed, she knew the word as an application here too damn well what she was doing. But he does make the point that the fairy tales retard the civilization of the Irish, and it was precisely that which Joyce had to contest. Although he did include 12 of Crofton's stories in his own collection of fairy tales, representative Irish fairy tales, which is huge, in point of fact, 70 total volume of 70 stories contained therein. So skipping ahead, and we're rather forced to abandon this rather provisional show on the wall. I want to make mention of the varieties of Catholicism going on. Now, it's well known that Joyce knew the tables of the law by heart. It's sort of that. He had a sticky back mind, and he walked concurrently around Stephen's Green, reciting every word. And J.F. Byrne, Lynch, in real life, had something the same to tell. Conscious memorization, a feat of unconscious memorization, it happened anyway. And he carried it to the point that, in fact, he included a significant section of the story, the Walk of the Artist, where, together with the priest's speech, confession, the terrorizing chapter 4, chapter 3 of the portrait, is entirely extracted from other sources. That second dimension being a translation of a Roman priest's hellfire speech. One third of, effectively 1/5 of the office, simply lifted from the pamphlet. Remarkable in his way. I'm not going to trouble you either with the character of Hearn, the somewhat cowardly Catholic who gets awfully close to the magical, the mystagogues of the Chemica, but eventually flies back into Catholicism. Yeats was a man of his class when he came to Catholicism, as indeed were his siblings, who were very scornful of Joyce's dogmas. Their dogmas exposed a view of the interior of those houses with dirty windows, and their women engaged in indescribable domestic acts. There's Lily's view of what she didn't want to read. But Ulysses is a different case. Joyce said, the education given to in Catholic schools seems to me be in all matters of general culture, substituting pedantry for taste. And he calls upon his brothers and sisters to testify that young Catholic men and women who have not been through the secondary school education system seem to be much more imaginative than Protestant boys and girls, and concludes this pedantry destroys religion as it destroys poetry, very evangelical, for it destroys all direct knowledge, etc. I made the point in conversation here the other day, I think, apropos Neil's paper, that we probably haven't yet fully assessed the impact of the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland in Irish cultural affairs, because it drove all those Protestant minds into theosophy. They needed somewhere where they would re-raise their minds, their souls as superior souls, which they had indeed been under the Anglican dispensation. So it was Ellen who mentioned, as Victor precisely quoted, that the encounter between the two, Joyce and Yeats, was that between a defected Catholic and a defected Protestant and a defected Catholic. But I would prefer to suggest the fact that it was a dispossessed Protestant and a possessed Catholic, because by then the Municipal Act of 1898 had given the Catholics control of the borough councils. So there was no sense at that stage that we were any longer in a greatly politically inferior situation. And I think a good deal proceeds from that fact, if we assess the mental effect on cohorts, on Sing's, on Joyce's cohort. We're mostly familiar with the passage in the Crucifixion of the Outcast, where we hear about Joachim de Flora, who considered that those who work to live, that those whose work was to live and not reveal were children of the Pope, who was their father. But Flora, Joachim, taught in silence, in secret, that certain others were elected to live, but to reveal the hidden substance of God, which is colour and music, and softness and sweet order, and that they have no father but the Holy Spirit. Joyce was clearly enamored of this, because these are indeed passages which he selects. He goes on, the world exists for that supreme art, which is to win from life and gather us into eternity like doves into their dovecote. Terms Joyce uses. Joyce's aesthetic baptism in the portrait occurs on the Strand when he sees a beauteous maiden, lovely girl, wading in the Strand with her skirt lifted up to her thigh, with incidentally a symbol formed seaweed on her leg. And at this point, he emits distinctly Joycean cries and said, his soul had risen from the grave of boyhood, spurning her brave toes. Yes, yes, he would great proudly out of the freedom and power of his soul, as a great artister whose name he bore, a living thing, a new, soaring and beautiful, impalpable, imperishable thing. That's actually the time he borrows Yeats's fabulous word, imperishable, from the Secret Rose. But at the same time, our author was writing an autobiography called Seaman Hero, which is, by any accounts, a badly written book, or bad literature, whatever about his grammatical qualities. And at one time, he allows himself to investigate his own person in an egotistical spirit. Joyce wrote in the book that egotism, the egotism which he always called his redeemer, seemed to suggest that the thoughts and feelings of the universe were converging upon him. The miracle of Joyce is that he went from being absolutely the egotistical first-person writer to being the third-person impersonal writer, who in the end only uses language as it occurs in the world, not as it occurs at the services of its own subjectivity. But if you want to know what he looked like or what he was like, this is it. A girl might or might not have thought him handsome. The face was regular in features, and its pose was almost softened into a beauty by a small feminine mouth. In general survey of the face, the eyes were quite fresh and fearless, but in spite of this, the face was, to a certain extent, the face of a debauchee. So clearly, has a flaneur component, a sort of stage for Johnny meets Parisian flaneur. Yeats, on his side, of course, was borrowing hard from Catholic religion and from Catholic ideology. And this is what makes their meeting so particularly interesting. Joyce said in Stephen Hero that he could well have become a Catholic, was it not for the first premise. The first premise being, of course, Christ, Salvador of the world, but also become a Protestant. But in other respects, he found the religion quite attractive, particularly since he loathed Catholicism. Victor, this is your chapter. I'm putting it aside at the moment. The next question I choose to raise, and I'm going to raise it to dismiss it in a very few words, is chaos theory, the extent to which these works are actually affected by a prevailing sense that the world was becoming chaotic amongst the literary elite. For Joyce, this appeared to be a condition to be entirely relevant, and which in fact becomes the substance of Finnegans Wake. Although we know there's an arranger putting things together, but nevertheless, what you encounter is a world of contingency, a word I've heard used here on a number of occasions. And that's the meat of the book. That's the point of the book, that the world is contingency. And it's precisely what I assume, if I have your permission, I may generalize and say that Yeats is seeking to banish mere contingency. Civilization is grouped together by manifold illusion. Illusion, mind you, which is, of course, very close neighbor of delusion. They might differ, but in a certain sense, they might have come out of the same place. Joyce found great sustenance, Yeats found great sustenance when he encountered Berkeley and Berkeley's idealism, largely because Berkeley was Anglo-Irish. That gave him a great problem. Sociologically speaking, Tito Burke, and we all know the second speech in which he says that Burke fought his battle of the Salamis for Ireland. Salamis being the Greek battle of 490, when Greeks established the Greek state and beat back the Persians. At the very moment when he used the phrase, "we Irish," which endowed Yeats with the right to use "we Irish" in his poem, the statues, "we Irish born in that ancient sect," poem which incidentally includes almost centrally the idea of our proper dog. The idea is that we Irish are pretty shady people, really, and we are probably the barbarism which is going to disrupt veins of civilization, which Yeats enjoys equally. No, sorry, there's a difference there to which I come very shortly. I was going to say, which they equally disparage, but that's just not true of Yeats, and that's a point I should rather underline. There are two Blakes, and I took the trouble of visiting the National Library some years ago, I might say, my last opportunity there, and made a beeline for, well, I went to Marshall Library and checked that out for Joyce's Giordano Bruno. And as you know, the case is, he took down the Giordano Bruno, but it wasn't the one that Yeats mentions in the stories. He also fabricates an entire narrative in which he finds Yeats's The Secret Rose in a barrel, takes it home for threepence, which can't be true, presumably he had it from George Russell. But he read it, and if he memorized it because he had to return the bloody book pretty shortly. But in the National Library, what I chose to look at was Yeats's adaptations to his own edition of Blake. And they're fairly fascinating because you'll see Yeats's skepticism coming in, He's not quite sure he's right here about symbolism. Not quite sure if lake system is a system rather than hardly the madness attributed to him by others, but less than a cosmic system. And in these notes here, there are fairly extensive passages copied, obviously, simply in addition to, or maybe a repetition of Edmund O'Shea's descriptive catalogue, but it's something I do. Now, time is short, and I'm going to move absolutely to the conclusion of my paper. I leave behind me the dreaming back. Joyce and Yeats were both interested in the Egyptian dead. There's a highly interesting question. When did Joyce and Yeats meet Vico, the formative idea of Finnegan's Wake? Joyce probably quite late, although he certainly met Benedetto Croce early in 1902, the year when he published his life of Vico. But it's not certain that he had actually read Vico at that stage. There is one notable echo from Benedetto Croce's Vico in the Circe episode of Ulysses. So he certainly knew the book before he wrote or finalized Ulysses. But Yeats made it a great deal later. He first came across Croce in 1915 when he was in Rome with his wife, and he subsequently conducted an search into the origin of fascism in the 1920s, the early 1920s. And at that stage, he read Vico very closely, and a number of other authors. He designed from the strength of what he meant there that every historian, every cyclic historian since was in fact, I think he called it a travesty of Vico. And Vico was the man when it came to circular history. And Vico thus makes an appearance. Now, we have this curious anomaly. James Joyce and W.B. Yeats rested heavily on the Neapolitan philosopher, Giambattista Vico, whose new science in 1720 was something of a turning point for arcane philosophy. It was, of course, arcane, and I wish to remind you that the arcanity was shared by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who James Joyce read very closely, because every time that he gave an account of Bruno's contradictions, he quoted verbatim from Coleridge, and indeed, one of his most accurate pastiches is a twice-repeated parody of Coleridge's Giordano Bruno in Table Talk. But Coleridge was followed by Thomas Carlyle, and Carlyle includes, amongst other things, the following: spiritual paralysis is the disease of our age. He's talking about industrialism, the mechanism. And Joyce plucked his famous term, in my view, spiritual paralysis from that source. But it also includes, as I earlier mentioned to Victor, a chapter entitled Heroes, Man and Letters. And James Joyce always described himself on his passport as Man of Letters. And those who remember the Epiphany will remember he said it was for the man of letters to record with scrupulous detail these things he has seen and heard. And the man of letters he meant wasn't actually the newspaper editor. It wasn't the lower type. It wasn't even the one he disparaged in Yeats, I'd like to suggest humbly. And it was the hero. It was the highest point which civilization in our era had reached. It had been the king and the priest, and now it was the man of letters who was about to issue forth the truth of the universe, with some help from the tree Yggdrasil, according to Joyce's earliest fantasy writings. This is really the part that I want to communicate with me, and I beg you to give me a few minutes to do it. Communicate to you, and that is the following. In Learson's book, which I've already mentioned, there are some very striking comparisons between Joyce and Yeats at the end. His title is called How Time Passes in my first read in Joyce's Dublin. And his argument is that James Joyce was fantastically Newtonian in Ulysses, and that he wasn't looking for an ahistorical literature. he was looking for the immediacy of life in any city in the world, of which Dublin was a good representative, and so it was. Dublin had the first tram system, the underground of the first tram system. Hugh Genner used to like to point out that Ulysses is the first novel in which telephones and typewriters appear. And in fact, it's simply because Blazes Boylan's secretary types 16th of June 1904 at the top of her letterhead that we know the date on which Ulysses said. There's no other point in the novel where we see that information. Typewriter is very crucial. So there may be an absolute cut-off point between Dubliners and Ulysses. It may be a different choice, maybe a different world, certainly a different Irish literature. Of Yeats, Pearson says, Yeats had a specific way of linking those stereotypes to his simplest fantasy program. There is, to begin with, the fact that Yeats, as a would-be mystic, sees the Irish West as a congenial ambience. I apologize for the cynicism of these remarks. For Yeats, the Irish peasantry is a repository of an ahistorical, pre-Christian faith and wisdom which may redeem modern readers from the banality of contemporary values. The best statement of banality of contemporary values may be H.G. Wells' letter to James Joyce, where it says, "You and I are different," and then goes to explain that Wells lives in a linear world where progress is possible, and Joyce lives in a circular world, which is which he shares a scatological imagination of Donald Swift. I more or less end here. He says, the great originality of Joyce is that he dared to describe an Irish setting in terms of its normalcy. But that was precisely the quality of which in all earlier authors, whatever their persuasion and sympathy, had denied Ireland. Either it was exotic, or it was mystical, or it was marginal, or barbarian. It took then one of the greatest innovatory geniuses in European literature to break through the mold of the ingrained discourse of marginality and alachrony, which had dominated his views of the representation. Now, I end with a question here. The question is it possible, having shifted from spiritual paralysis to Jonian clockwork, wandering lost, Ulysses, that James Joyce shifted once again to the Yeatsian position and tried to diagram a non-temporal world in which all historical events are essentially simultaneous, which is more or less what the vision does, or at least repetition simultaneous, so that the idea of eternal returns, which is the fundamental idea of Finnegan's Wake, is there and present. I have failed to quote the passage in which Joyce teaches his father's dream were all telescopes. We're all only telescopes, he says in Hiberno, but it's there. Joyce did pay attention to what Yeats wrote in, will there ever be any Yeats? Wrote in a vision. I read you on that note, assuming that you grasp my intention to suggest that the meaning of Yeats' vision and the meaning of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake at some level share the same cosmological project.
We certainly have comments and questions, but we don't have much time. But maybe for
We can do
one
We
question,
can do
one
one
comment.
question and then decide the ban. You've been in it for some time. That's okay. Let's do one question.
Sorry, one question, yes.
Yeah, that was great. Really fascinating. I'm just wondering whether you'd agree that Joyce parodies the dreaminess of the revival, Yeatsian revival, more in Dubliners. And with the Figures Wake, it comes back to a kind of dream mode, because it's a book of the dark, and so that there's a way in which there's a kind of revisiting of dreaming back as maybe Yeats had a point.
Well, probably can't answer that question actually. I mean, I'm not probably sure, but I know that Joyce's interest in Egyptian dreaming back was first of all is the immense popularity of that book at that stage. There's no question about that. There's another and discovering that the Egyptians had a philosophy and the tombs meant something, and all those figures and that language which had been amazingly translated gave instructions on how to get your soul out of your body back through your own experience into a rebirthable condition. And Joyce's circular sentence in Finnegan's Wake is a rebirth. There's no question. Of course, it does that, but of course it doesn't do it for the individual soul. Of course, it does it for the chaos as a whole, for everything. And if there is a dreamery, romantic thing in the Irish revival, it's obviously early period. And by the way, the point is sometimes made that Joyce only really knew the early Yeats. I mean, Joyce had always, as the only student who didn't woo the Countess Kathleen. He loudly clapped Florence for when she sang Who Will Go With Fergus. And it does seem there's a gap in Joyce's reading of Yeats. He does have the big clock tower, and that's where it stops. So for him, Yeats was really, I call him the Yeats of more calm. No more civic.
Please join me round of applause.
So the students will guide you to the parking lot where the bus is leaving from, because they can't come through the steep way that you're used to. So we're going down via the library. I'm asking the students to help you guys get there, okay?